For 6 months, peace had settled over Caleb Whitmore's remote Arizona ranch like a soft blanket. The war was over, the treaties signed, and Tobias, once just a quiet rancher, had become a symbol of reconciliation between settlers and the Apache. But peace, as he would soon learn, is a fragile thing. One summer evening, he spotted 5 riders tearing across the eastern ridge, dust flying behind them. He recognized the look in their eyes, violence, not diplomacy. Among them was Lucas Harwood, brother of the disgraced Colonel Morrison, whose corruption Tobias had exposed. In his hand, Clayton held a blood-stained Apache headband, proof he had captured Tahoma, Tobias's friend, and the Apache diplomat responsible for the peace treaty. Clayton offered a brutal ultimatum: sign a false confession that would clear his brother's name and undo the truth, or watch Tahoma die. With only 1 hour to decide, Tobias rode into town and set a plan in motion using the signal system the Apache had taught him to call for help. The showdown at Devil's Canyon was tense, with guns drawn and Tahoma's life hanging in the balance. But Tobias chose not violence but words. He spoke with courage and clarity, exposing Clayton's plot and reminding everyone present that war would consume them all. Just as chaos threatened to erupt, arrows rained down from the canyon rim. Apache warriors had arrived. Marshal Reeves stood firm with federal authority, and cavalry reinforcements thundered in. In the final moment, Tobias hurled the sacred war lance to save Tahoma, and Bradley put a bullet through Clayton's heart before he could do more damage. What followed was a federal investigation that exposed a network of war profiteers aiming to restart the conflict for personal gain. President Taylor honored Tobias with a federal appointment as Indian agent, recognizing his role in protecting peace. The Apache too honored him, offering a second war lance, this time not for battle but for peace. Years later, Tobias still returns to the old well, where it all began, remembering how one simple act of kindness, a drink of water, set into motion a new future. For older Americans who know that true courage is quiet and that peace must be defended with both strength and compassion, Tobias's story is a legacy worth remembering. For many older Americans, especially those who grew up with Westerns or lived through times of national division, the story of Caleb Whitmore isn't just a tale of frontier justice. It's a mirror reflecting the enduring struggle between truth and power, peace and revenge, honor and survival. Tobias was a simple rancher in the Arizona Territory, a man who offered water to a wounded Apache warrior, a gesture of mercy, in a time when such kindness could cost a man his life. That single act sparked a chain of events that led him to become the first white man in territorial history to be honored by the Apache and carry a sacred war lance. But peace, Tobias would learn, is never permanent. 6 months later, a dust cloud rose from the eastern ridge and 5 riders approached his land, their guns ready and intentions clear. At their head rode Lucas Harwood, brother of the disgraced Colonel Tobias had helped expose for corruption. In his hand was a blood-stained Apache headband, a cruel sign that Tahoma, the diplomat and Tobias's friend, had been captured. Morrison demanded Tobias sign a false confession blaming the Apache for fabricated crimes. Refuse and Tahoma would die. It was a test not just of courage but of legacy. What followed was a tense showdown in Devil's Canyon, a narrow gulch where every heartbeat echoed like thunder. Tobias faced 5 armed men alone, yet he didn't rely on bullets. He relied on the wisdom passed down to him from both the white world and the Apache people who had accepted him as brother. With war looming and Tahoma's life on the line, Tobias chose not violence but words. He challenged the killers with truth, exposing their plan and calling on the Apache signal system, a knowledge he had quietly earned. Arrows flew, federal cavalry arrived, and in a single moment of selfless courage, Tobias hurled the war lance to save his friend. It wasn't just a rescue, it was a statement: peace would not die in that canyon. For older Americans, the story resonates on a deeply personal level. Many have lived through moments when doing what's right came at a cost, during wartime, in the civil rights movement, or simply when standing up against injustice in everyday life. Tobias's actions remind us that true strength doesn't always lie in the barrel of a gun, but in the courage to stand alone for what is just. What came after was just as powerful. A federal investigation revealed a vast conspiracy to reignite war for profit. Tobias was honored by both the U.S. government and the Apache people, appointed as a federal Indian agent, and presented with a second war lance, symbolizing peace. Years later, he still returns to the well where it all began, remembering that a single drink of water, a small act of compassion, changed not only his life, but the fate of an entire region. In a world that often feels divided, Caleb Whitmore's story is a quiet, powerful reminder to older generations. You are never too old to stand for truth, never too far gone to choose peace, and never too small to make a difference. In the end, it's not grand speeches or heroic charges that define history. It's the simple moments of human decency that ripple outward, touching lives and building bridges, sometimes across cultures, sometimes across generations, and always across time. In the unforgiving heat of the Arizona Territory 1847, a rancher named Caleb Whitmore made a decision that would ripple across history not with fanfare or force, but with a single act of human decency. A wounded Apache warrior lay crumpled near his well, bleeding, barely able to lift his hand toward the water bucket. Tobias, a former soldier and a man who had seen enough death to know the risks, chose to do something simple yet dangerous. He gave the man water. That moment of compassion, just a sip from a wooden ladle, could have ended his life. In those days, offering aid to a Native American was often seen as betrayal. But Tobias wasn't guided by politics. He was guided by conscience. What he didn't know was that the young man he saved was Tahoma, an Apache diplomat, and the son of Chief Waya, tasked with negotiating a fragile peace treaty with the United States government. What followed was no less than extraordinary. Through Tahoma, Tobias was drawn into a world most settlers feared or misunderstood. He earned the trust of the Apache, and in time became the only white man in territorial history to be gifted a war lance, a symbol of honor and brotherhood. The peace they helped forge stood for 6 months, long enough for hope to take root in a land more used to blood and betrayal. But peace, as Tobias would learn, is never without its enemies. One summer evening, a cloud of dust signaled the return of violence. 5 riders stormed his land, led by Lucas Harwood, brother of the disgraced colonel whose corruption Tobias had helped expose. In his hand was Tahoma's blood-stained headband. The message was clear: Tahoma had been kidnapped, and Tobias had 1 hour to sign a false confession, or watch his friend die. The confrontation at Devil's Canyon was a classic Western standoff, the kind older Americans will remember from stories past, but it played out with a modern moral weight. Tobias didn't bring an army. He didn't fire the first shot. Instead, he rode in a lone war lance at his side, carrying the values that had come to define his journey: integrity, loyalty, and the belief that peace must be protected, not assumed. What he faced was an ambush, not a negotiation. Guns pointed down from the canyon rim. Tahoma, bloodied and bound, was held at knife point. But Tobias had something more powerful than bullets: truth and the courage to speak it. He called out Morrison's lies, exposed the conspiracy to reignite war for profit, and reminded everyone present that another war would not just kill men but destroy futures for white settlers and native children alike. And just when all seemed lost, help arrived, not in the form of cavalry alone, but from Apache warriors who had heard Tobias's call. Arrows flew and chaos erupted. In a moment frozen in time, Tobias hurled his war lance, a gift from the Apache, to save Tahoma. 1 man died. Another was saved. And the path to peace once again was held together by the thinnest of threads and the boldest of hearts. For older audiences, this story resonates in a way few modern tales do. Many have lived through moments where kindness seemed weak, where doing what's right meant standing alone, and where truth was not always popular. But they also know something younger generations may still be learning: lasting change begins not with orders but with decency. After the dust settled, an investigation revealed a web of corruption involving arms dealers and government agents, all eager to profit from renewed war. But it didn't succeed because 1 man gave water to a dying stranger. For that act, Tobias was honored by the president and by the Apache people, named a federal Indian agent and guardian of the peace. Years later, he still returns to that well, not just to remember what happened, but to remind himself and others that great legacies aren't built on power. They're built on principle, on doing the right thing when no one's watching, on believing that even in the harshest deserts, 1 drop of kindness can bring life. Because sometimes the moment that changes everything starts with something as simple as water. Caleb Whitmore never set out to be a hero. He was just a rancher, a man who had seen too much war, too much hate, and had chosen to live quietly among the sun-bleached rocks and stubborn mesquite of the Arizona Territory. But fate has a way of calling on those who least expect it, and for Tobias it all began with a wounded Apache warrior bleeding beside his well. He could have walked away. In 1847, helping a Native American, especially one dressed for war, was enough to get a man hanged by his neighbors or burned out of his home. But Tobias didn't see a threat. He saw a human being dying of thirst. So he gave him water. That simple act of kindness, ordinary in any decent society, was in that moment revolutionary. The warrior was Tahoma, a respected Apache diplomat and son of Chief Waya. What Tobias didn't know was that Tahoma had been tasked with negotiating peace between the U.S. government and the Apache tribes. That sip of water, offered without demand or judgment, would become the first brick in a fragile bridge between 2 peoples scarred by generations of violence. Over the next 6 months, Tobias became an unlikely figure of unity. He earned the Apache's trust, stood beside Tahoma during the signing of a tentative treaty, and was even gifted a ceremonial war lance, an honor never before granted to a white man. He was no longer just a rancher. He had become a symbol of something rare and desperately needed reconciliation. But peace, as every seasoned soul knows, is hard, won and easily broken. One dusty evening, 5 riders tore across the ridge. At their head rode Lucas Harwood, brother of the disgraced Colonel Tobias had helped expose for corruption. He came bearing a message in a blood-stained headband. Tahoma had been captured, and unless Tobias signed a false confession blaming the Apache for fabricated crimes, Tahoma would be executed. What unfolded at Devil's Canyon wasn't just a standoff between good and evil. It was a test of everything Tobias had come to stand for. He rode in alone, knowing it could be a trap, but unwilling to abandon his friend. Tahoma, after all, had risked his life for peace. Could Tobias do any less? Facing 5 guns, Tobias didn't draw first. He spoke. With the war lance at his side and Apache wisdom in his heart, he called out the conspiracy. He exposed the real enemy, not the Apache, not the settlers, but the profiteers and power-hungry men who thrived on keeping both sides afraid of each other. As tensions escalated, Apache warriors revealed themselves on the canyon rim, arrows ready. Marshal Reeve arrived with federal authority, and the cavalry thundered in moments later. It should have been the end of it, but hatred dies hard. Clayton, cornered and unraveling, ordered Tahoma's execution, even if it meant killing his own man to do it. In that moment, Tobias did what few would have dared. He hurled the war lance, the same one passed down through generations of Apache warriors, with perfect aim. It struck the would-be killer and saved Tahoma. Seconds later, Marshal Reeve ended Clayton's life with a single shot. What came next was more than justice, it was revelation. Federal investigators uncovered a web of corruption stretching across state lines. Weapons dealers, politicians, military men, all of them ready to sacrifice thousands for profit. But none of it had come to pass, because one man gave water to a stranger. For older Americans who have lived through war, segregation, political corruption, and cultural upheaval, Caleb Whitmore's story is more than a Western. It's a reminder. A reminder that decency matters, that we are strongest when we act from a place of empathy, not fear, and that healing is possible when we choose to see the humanity in those we've been taught to fear. In the weeks that followed Devil's Canyon, Tobias was honored not just by Washington but by the Apache themselves. They offered him a second lance, this one carved with symbols of both nations, bearing a single word in English, and Apache peace. He was appointed as a federal Indian agent tasked with protecting the very treaty he had helped forge. Years later, Tobias would return to that same well every July. Not because he had to, but because he needed to remember. That one act of kindness, so small, so seemingly insignificant, had not only saved a life, but changed the course of 2 nations. As he stood there watching the water ripple, he knew this, not war, was how the world was meant to change. For older viewers who have witnessed the weight of history firsthand, Tobias's story carries a truth we don't hear enough. It's never too late to choose what's right. Never too late to build bridges. Never too late to let compassion speak louder than hatred. Because sometimes the most powerful legacy you can leave behind is peace. There are men who shape history not through war or wealth, but through the quiet, unwavering courage to do what is right. Caleb Whitmore was one such man. A rancher in the Arizona Territory during the volatile year of 1847, he didn't seek recognition or reward. All he ever wanted was peace on his land, in his heart, and between the peoples that had long stood on opposite sides of blood and bitterness. But peace, Tobias learned, begins with a choice. One hot afternoon, he found a wounded Apache warrior lying beside his well, bleeding, gasping, reaching for water just inches out of reach. In a time when tensions between settlers and native tribes were razor-thin, offering help to an enemy could get a man lynched. But Tobias didn't hesitate. He gave him water. He saved his life. That young man was Tahoma, son of Chief Waya, and one of the Apache's most important peace emissaries. Tobias's act of kindness not only spared a life, it opened the door to an alliance once thought impossible. Over the following months, Tobias earned the trust of the Apache, became their brother in spirit, and was gifted a ceremonial war lance, an honor no other white man had ever received. He helped broker a fragile peace between the U.S. government and the tribes of the Southwest. But the shadows of the past rarely die quietly. 6 months later, Tobias's land was thundered upon by 5 armed riders. At their head was Lucas Harwood, brother of the disgraced colonel whose crimes Tobias had helped expose. Morrison came with a bloodied Apache headband and a brutal ultimatum: sign a false confession and clear his brother's name or watch Tahoma die. It was a trap, a political scheme, a personal vendetta, but above all, it was a threat to everything Tobias had helped build. He had 1 hour. What followed at Devil's Canyon was a turning point not just for Tobias but for the entire region. Alone, outgunned and cornered, Tobias rode into the canyon not with vengeance but with purpose. He didn't come to sign lies. He came to speak truth, to defend peace not with bullets but with conviction. When Morrison's men prepared to kill Tahoma, Tobias made a split-second decision that would define his legacy. He hurled the war lance gifted to him by a people who had once viewed him as the enemy across the canyon to strike down Tahoma's would-be killer. Moments later, Marshal Reeve, a young lawman mentored by Tobias, fired the fatal shot that ended Morrison's bloody plot. But that day was more than a rescue. It was a revelation. The aftermath uncovered a sweeping conspiracy of arms dealers, corrupt officials, and power brokers who had hoped to restart the Apache Wars for profit. Their plan failed because one man stood in the gap, because one man dared to believe peace was worth fighting for, and dignity was worth dying for. President Zachary Taylor issued a personal commendation to Caleb Whitmore, naming him federal Indian agent for the entire Southwest. More importantly, the Apache Council, led by Chief Waya, bestowed upon him a second lance, this one not for war but for peace. Carved with symbols of both Apache and settler cultures, it bore a single word in both languages: peace. To the people of the territory, white and native alike, Tobias became more than a man. He became a bridge, a living testament to the power of moral courage, mutual respect, and the belief that shared humanity always outweighs inherited hatred. 2 years later, the Southwest had changed. Trade routes were safe. Schools welcomed children from both sides. Corruption in the territorial government had been rooted out, with Tobias helping draft new laws that protected native rights and ensured federal oversight. The peace had held not through fear but through trust. And every year on the anniversary of that fateful day, Tobias would return to the well where it all began. There he would reflect on what that moment had taught him: that real change rarely comes from power. It comes from principle. It comes from seeing the face of a wounded stranger and choosing compassion. For older Americans, those who have seen war divisions, civil rights marches, and political unrest, Tobias's story is more than a Western legend. It's a reminder that the hardest battles are often not fought with guns but with integrity. That justice doesn't ride in on a horse, it rises up in the hearts of men and women who refuse to look away when truth is threatened. Caleb Whitmore didn't just save a life, he saved a future. And in doing so, he gave all of us a map not to conquest but to coexistence. In the summer of 1847, Caleb Whitmore was just a quiet rancher trying to live out the rest of his life in the Arizona Territory. He wasn't a politician, a soldier, or a preacher. He wasn't seeking a cause or a banner to wave. He had known the cruelty of war, the bitterness of betrayal, and the loneliness of survival. All he wanted was to mend his fences, feed his livestock, and stay out of trouble. But trouble, it turned out, was not finished with him. It came in the form of a wounded Apache warrior lying crumpled by his well, bleeding and reaching for a sip of water. That man was Tahoma, son of Chief Waya, and a key negotiator in the fragile peace process between the Apache tribes and the United States government. Tobias could have walked away. In those days, helping an Apache could earn a man a noose, but he didn't. He offered water. He offered kindness. And in doing so, he changed the course of history. What began as an act of compassion turned into an unlikely alliance. Tahoma survived, and Tobias found himself drawn into a larger world of diplomacy, tradition, and honor. Over the next 6 months, he earned the trust of the Apache people, stood with Tahoma in the signing of a peace agreement, and was given the sacred war lance, an honor never before granted to a white man. But peace is a delicate thing, and it has many enemies. That truth came galloping across the eastern ridge when 5 armed riders stormed Tobias's land. Their leader was Lucas Harwood, brother of the disgraced Colonel Tobias had helped bring down for corruption. Clayton came with a blood-stained Apache headband and an ultimatum: sign a false confession, blame the Apache, and restore his brother's name or Tahoma would be executed. Tobias had 1 hour to decide. He didn't waste it. With the instincts of a man who had lived through too many betrayals, Tobias set a plan in motion. Using the signal system the Apache had taught him, he summoned aid. Then he rode to Devil's Canyon, a lone war lance at his side, knowing it could be his final ride. The standoff that followed was part Western showdown, part moral crucible. Outnumbered and surrounded, Tobias didn't reach for his gun, he reached for truth. He called out the corruption. He warned of war. And when Tahoma's life was seconds from ending, Tobias acted. He hurled his war lance with perfect aim, striking the would-be killer and saving his friend. Marshal Reeve, loyal and brave, fired the fatal shot that ended Clayton's madness. Federal cavalry arrived moments later, sealing the outcome. But that was just the beginning. The investigation that followed uncovered a web of corruption stretching across the territory: arms dealers, government officials, profiteers, men who stood to gain from war and death. Their plan was to destroy the peace treaty, blame the Apache, and reignite the conflict. They failed because Caleb Whitmore didn't. For his courage and integrity, President Zachary Taylor signed a personal commendation honoring Tobias's actions in preserving peace. But the recognition didn't stop there. Tobias was formally adopted by the Apache people and named Brother Wolf. The tribal elders presented him with a second war lance, this one carved with symbols of both nations and bearing a single word in English in Apache peace. He was appointed as federal Indian agent for the Southwest Territory, reporting directly to Washington. His mission to help expand peace treaties, represent tribal interests, and ensure that what happened at Devil's Canyon would never happen again. To the people of the territory, Caleb Whitmore became a living bridge between two worlds. 2 years later, the landscape had transformed. 17 Apache bands, 3 Navajo clans, and 4 Pueblo communities had joined in formal peace agreements. Trade routes were safe. Schools had opened to both native and settler children. Laws were passed to prevent corruption in the marshal's office and to guarantee tribal sovereignty. And through it all, Tobias never stopped being the man who offered water to a stranger. He married a school teacher named Clara, and together they raised 3 children who spoke both English and Apache. He spent his days traveling between tribal councils and federal meetings, always carrying 2 lances, one for war and one for peace, though God willing he hoped to never raise the first again. Each year on the anniversary of that fateful day, he returned to the well, not for celebration but for remembrance. He stood where it all began and reminded himself and those who came to listen that history doesn't turn on cannons or treaties alone. It turns on small, quiet choices like sharing water with someone the world calls your enemy. For older Americans, Caleb Whitmore's story is more than legend. It's a lesson. It tells us that one man, no matter how ordinary, can shape the future through moral courage. That reconciliation is possible even in the dust and blood of the frontier. And that peace, true peace, is not won by force but by decency, dignity, and the will to do what's right when no one else will. And sometimes that's all it takes. In a world that often feels divided and uncertain, the story of Caleb Whitmore offers a quiet but powerful reminder. Real change begins with small acts of kindness. Tobias didn't change history by leading armies or passing laws. He did it by offering water to a wounded stranger. That simple act of compassion became the seed of peace between 2 nations long torn apart by violence and mistrust. For older Americans who have lived through decades of conflict, social change, and personal loss, this lesson resonates deeply. You don't need to be powerful to do something meaningful. You just need to be willing. Tobias also teaches us that doing what's right often comes at a cost. He faced isolation, danger, and the threat of death because he stood up for truth and justice. And yet, by choosing integrity over convenience, he helped prevent a war, protect the innocent, and inspire generations to come. It's a reminder that the legacy we leave behind isn't built by playing it safe. It's built by standing firm in the moments that matter most. Most importantly, Tobias's journey reminds us that it's never too late to make a difference. Whether you're 30 or 70, a rancher or a retiree, each of us carries the power to bring dignity, hope, and healing into the world. In a time when empathy is often in short supply, the courage to be kind may be the most heroic act of all.